Hello, everyone. Welcome back to our Bible study through the book of Isaiah. We are kind of getting into a new section today in chapters 13 through, I think, 23, where Isaiah is going to be turning some of his attention away from Judah, and God's turning his attention away from Judah, and Isaiah is going to be prophesying to some other people. We'll talk about that as we open up and get into our outline today. You can download the outline at our website at tobelikechrist.com if you want it. Let's go ahead and get into chapter 13. And the application today, I think, is really important, so stick around for that one. The first section we always cover when our timeline of Isaiah is going to be a little bit different today. We've mentioned that the prophetic ministry of Isaiah spans 4 kings. We don't exactly have exact dates for the prophecy that's found in Isaiah 13. It's probably safe to say it was probably spoken in the late 8th century BC, which would be like between 750 to 700 BC. For our key figures and our key nations here, I guess you could say, in this chapter, we have Isaiah, who is God's prophet. We have the nation of Babylon, who this chapter is going to center around. It's the object of God's judgment, prophetic judgment in this chapter. And then we have the Medes. This was a people group that developed into a pretty powerful nation in what is now modern-day Iran. God intended to use them to be the punishers, the judgment force on the Babylonian Empire later on in history. The words we want to define today appear in the last verse and in the first verse. The first one is oracle. This is a divine announcement. It's a message from God. So the chapter opens up an oracle against Babylon. It's God's message about what he's going to do to the nation of Babylon. And then jackal is in verse 22. This is a medium-sized dog, a wild dog that's native to Africa and kind of the Europe, Asia area. Okay, so 22 verses today, God's verdict on Babylon, and a little bit of introduction information that I touched on here at the beginning. This chapter begins a new section in the book. God turns his attention away from Judah and Israel, and he turns it towards the foreign nations that had either direct or indirect connection to God's people. Isaiah 13 is God's verdict against Babylon. At the time that this prophecy was spoken, the Babylonians were actually under the control of the Assyrians, and they were kind of the world power at this time. Babylon would eventually rise up to be the dominant world empire, but they wouldn't remain there because, as we'll read in this chapter, God intends to humble them and to bring them down. So they aren't even the greatest nation in the world at the time, but God is prophesying about when they will be. So not only does he prophesy that Babylon will, become a world power, but also that they're going to be defeated. And there's a great prophecy moving towards the end of this chapter about actually who will defeat them. And that doesn't happen for quite a while. So let's get into this. The opening of the chapter describes God rallying an army to himself, gathering an army from all over the place, across the world. A battle standard is raised up on the top of this hill, and then mighty warriors assemble to God's army in this place, and they assemble in great numbers. They're a great multitude. God intended to use this army to destroy Babylon and its influence. The day of the Lord, that's a key piece of language in this chapter and also throughout the prophets. The day of the Lord was going to come. This was going to be a day of verdict for Babylon that would shake nations and topple empires. So the day of the Lord usually just refers to a great day of God's judgment. And that can that day can depend based on what the context is and the people that God is prophesying against. In this case, the day of the Lord is the judgment of Babylon. In other places, it's the judgment against other nations. No human being was going to be able to resist the fierceness of God's judgment on that day. The day of the Lord would be, quote, cruel with wrath and fierce anger to make the land a desolation and to destroy its sinners from it. So this is God's wrath against a land that's become filled with sinners, people that don't listen to him, people that don't respect his moral code, his moral law, and the way that he wants them to live. The upheaval of that day is figuratively described by Isaiah with these words. He says, quote, "The stars of the heavens and their constellations will not give their light. The sun will be dark at its rising. The moon will not shed its light. The heavens tremble and the earth will be shaken out of its place at the wrath of the Lord of hosts in the day of his fierce anger." Now, I don't think what God's saying here is that these things are going to happen literally. The stars are going to fall from heaven, that the earth is going to be shaken out of its place, like it's shaken out of its orbit or something like that. I think this is prophetic language, and we'll talk about this more in our application, that is meant to be understood in a symbolic way. It's talking about just the upheaval of all things, especially here in the geopolitical sphere, that the greatest nation on earth is going to fall, and they're going to fall mightily. The earth is going to shake when they hit the ground, basically. And so God is going to cause huge upheaval on the world stage, and it's described with this kind of language. God would desecrate Babylon for their evil, their iniquity, and he says their pompous pride, and it would be a merciless day. Everybody would fall by the sword. Now, one of the most amazing parts about this prophecy is that Isaiah prophesied the nation that God would use to overthrow Babylon. He was actually going to use another country. This is the army, that he's gathering at the beginning of the chapter. The army would be the Medes. When this prophecy was spoken, the Medes were, not a world power. They were significantly less powerful than the Babylonians, and especially the Assyrians. So Isaiah's prophecy was spoken sometime between 750 to 700 BC, but the Medes didn't end up conquering the Babylonians, like Isaiah is saying here, till about 539 BC. That's about 200 years later. So this couldn't have just been, some lucky guess. This was a specific prediction calling out the nation that would 2 centuries later conquer this other nation. So it's very specific. So it's a very important biblical prophecy that proves the inspiration of Isaiah, his words, and the Bible as a whole. Isaiah concludes this chapter prophesying that Babylon would never be rebuilt and it would become a haunt for jackals and hyenas. Okay, so now for our application, and this is a bit of an application and also a bit of Bible comprehension. There's some language that we just read that appears in this chapter that appears elsewhere in the Bible and is very commonly misunderstood. So prophetic language, like poetic language, is not always meant to be understood literally. When Isaiah prophesied that the stars of the heavens and their constellations will not give their light, the sun will be dark at its rising, the moon will not shed its light, he doesn't appear to mean this literally. He uses this language to describe the upheaval and the turmoil and these world-altering events. What's important to know is that this language appears several times in the prophets when describing several historical events. See Ezekiel chapter 32, verse 7, where God's actually prophesying against the nation of Egypt in that case. And the Jews would have understood this language this way. It's not to be taken literally. The moon isn't going to disappear. The stars aren't falling out of heaven. This is God's way of describing a great day of his judgment and things being shaken up. Language like this appears also in the New Testament in chapters like Matthew chapter 24 and other places. And it's really, really important that we understand it the way that the Jews would have understood it if they heard it in their day, because that's going to allow us to properly interpret those passages. I know a lot of people who are constantly looking for prophetic fulfillments through physical signs, like the sun going dark, like eclipses, or stars falling from heaven, like meteor showers or shooting stars. But I think this is probably a misguided way to interpret prophecy. It arises from not understanding the original context and not understanding the way that the Jews would have understand their own prophets and their prophetic expressions. And I'll just mention this as well, and we'll pretend like this doesn't take us, well over 5 minutes. But people are always asking me, will you do the book of Revelation? I want to study the book of Revelation. It intrigues a lot of people, and it intrigues me, and it's a really interesting study, obviously. And interestingly, some of this kind of language appears in the book of Revelation. And I would really encourage people, don't go run off to Revelation and study it first, and study it without a background in the biblical prophets. Revelation wasn't written in a vacuum. It was written to people who would have been familiar and had these Old Testament documents, who would have been familiar with this prophetic language. And I don't think that you can really properly understand Revelation unless you understand prophets and the way that they talked and the connections between their language and what's presented in Revelation. Prophets like Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel. I think that's necessary foundation work to properly understand Revelation, because if you don't have that, people will present all kinds of wild views of Revelation. And if you don't have kind of this foundation for how this prophetic language was originally used and some of the images that we'll see later on in these books that appear in Revelation, you're just going to be people are going to misguide you and tell you all kinds of stuff, and you're not going to have the foundation to say, I don't think that's actually the way that was being used, or the way that these Jewish authors intended that to be understood, because there's some language like that in the prophets, and I'm able to discern a little bit better my interpretation of Revelation based on my foundation in the prophets. So That's why I haven't done Revelation yet. We'll do that at the end, where I think it belongs. So, yeah, anyway, that's our study for today. Probably another long one, but really important work here to set ourselves up to understand what's going on in the rest of this book and in the rest of the Bible.